There's one event every 5 years that determines industry best practices and recommendations, and we're giving you an inside look at it all. Welcome to another episode of The Route, School Bus Fleet's video and podcast series that keeps you in the know. I'm Amanda Huggett, your executive editor. Today we're going to talk about the National Congress on School Transportation, or NCST, with several folks involved in it. This episode of The Route is sponsored by IC Bus. The next generation is here and is ahead of its class. Let's get rolling. So why are we talking about the NCST at all? Well, because it's a highly influential event that dictates much of what we all deal with every day in this industry. So if you're not familiar with it yet, you really should be. And I'm going to fill you in right now. The 2025 NCST was the 17th annual event held in Des Moines, Iowa. It actually started in 1939, where industry leaders gathered to agree on regulations and best practices. That very first one is to thank for the specific shade of yellow used on school buses even today. For the past few decades, it's been held every 5 years to update guidance and recommendations. And it's conducted just like a real Congress, with proposed measures read aloud, the ability for debate, amendments, and official voting. Because of the pandemic, the 2020 event was canceled, so this was the first one in 10 years. Each state is invited to have a presence, with up to 7 delegates and 2 alternates representing the best interests of what they do in their respective area. Committees form based on certain topics to research and propose changes to the previous guidance. The final decisions become the National School Transportation Specifications and Procedures, or NSTSP, manual. About 8 states adopt that manual in full for its own state regulations, and many others adopt portions of it. Many call it the Bible of the industry, and it's often called upon in crucial matters or legal debates. So let's listen in on some conversations that I had with 4 people as they shared their inside take on this year's Congress. We're going to cover what goes into preparing for the event, what the key outcomes were, the biggest debates, and what it means for the industry moving forward. I am joined by Mike LaRocco, the Director of School Transportation in Indiana. Mike, thank you so much for joining us on the route and for being such a strong figure for the NCST.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
I did give our viewers just a very brief overview of what the NCST is in case they were unaware. But tell me from your perspective, what's the significance of it? What does it mean for the industry? And what does that kind of final manual that comes out of it?
Well, the significance is that, and then this applies outside the school transportation community, where we have a lot of industries that would love to self-regulate, but you know what that means. And we've seen some of the results of that. Well, the school transportation industry is completely different than that. We do a lot of self-regulation. It's very effective. For example, and the one that I give that kind of flabbergasts people is the color of a school bus is not mandated by any federal government. We do that internally as part of the self-regulation for the school transportation industry for the safety of our kids. So the significance is to set up the best practices for a national standard, for lack of a better word, for the safe transportation of our kids. And that manual is where it's a great resource to go to for any school transportation person, any parent, anybody that's interested in school transportation can review that to see the recommendations from their peers across the country as to what is the best way to operate and to set up your buses. And I will tell you from my perspective, I routinely am in that document to get language or to look at something to make sure that my thinking is correct. Our legislators or our regulators, why did they do this? Why did they make this law? Why did they make this regulation? Well, now you got to actually see it, and it can make a little bit more sense as to why these are being done. Well, I'd love to see hundreds upon hundreds of people just out there watching, just being part of the process. This whole process culminating in that one document is what sets the standard for how we can become we are the safest ground transportation on the planet. And I think that's just a tribute to what the school transportation community does, but this process is what sets that framework so that you can operate safely.
So you were on the steering committee for NCST. What was that process like? What was your role in this whole thing?
My role really was kind of like herding cats, but the cats in this case know where they're going and know what they're wanting to do. So I just kind of keep them in a straight line to go to get where they're going. And so the process is just to make sure that all the writing committees, the steering committee, the state delegations, everything is going towards that implementation of that Congress. And so it's
Mhm.
just trying to keep all the pieces moving and in, for lack of a better word, in Congress with each other.
What did it look like for you leading up to the Congress? Did you do anything to prepare, and how far in advance did that start? I mean, especially considering it's been 10 years since we had one.
Right. Well, when you consider the steering committee started right after the 2015 Congress, because there is an interim amendment process. If we continue with 5 years in between, there has to be some way to update the NSTSP between those 5 year periods. So there's an interim process, and then you get into the actual process. It usually starts about 2.5 years in advance of the actual Congress to start the process of getting the committees going, making sure they're all staffed for volunteers, and they start the process to look at that NSTSP and see what changes need to be made.
Yeah.
And so we really kind of did it twice because we set up for 2020. That fell apart because of COVID. So we had to then reshuffle and do it again for this Congress. So it was a little bit like practice to a certain degree. Yes.
There we go. That's the silver lining.
Mhm.
So you brought some of your teammates with Indiana with you. What was the rest of your team's role in this Congress, though? Provides besides some comedic relief. What did they?
Right. Their primary purpose, why I had them come along, is because any good organization has a succession plan. Who's
Mhm.
going to take over for them when they leave? And so I brought those two along just in case down the road, if I'm not around, whatever, I retire, they would know what the process would be like. And if they were the ones that were stepping into my role, they would know how to put that in place. And then I put them to practical use. I didn't want them sitting on their rear ends doing nothing. So they came out, they were very helpful in counting all of the delegation votes and providing that communication and some, for I guess the best word would be transparency into how the process was going.
All right, now I have joining with us Tina Mitchell, the special needs coordinator at Greenville County Schools in South Carolina. Walk me through what NCST was like for you this year, um, what your involvement was, what the process was like.
Well, I think for me it was more to see how many people are involved in transportation and really feel passionate about transportation. That showed that the whole country cares about transporting students safely. The committees worked extremely hard this year. I feel it's been such a long time since, we've had the Congress get together like this. And so there was a lot of work to be done by the committees, and seeing how much passion and work they actually put into getting it right, making sure our kids are safe. I think that to me was a, a, a worthy cause for me to be there, be part of it, to actually experience it was really good for me. It really brought it home. I was on 4 committees.
Wow.
I was on the infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. I was on students with disabilities, and I was on bus specifications. And then I was on the technical review committee as well. Being on those committees was really good for me because it showed me how it operates, and the states get to put in their input or their concerns or their ideas, and the committees get to review it, discuss it, talk about it, and bring forth their recommendations. So I think the give and take actually worked well, because once we actually got to the Congress, it almost run like clockwork, really.
And we've got Alex Spann, State Director for Tennessee. Thank you for joining us. Alex, as a State Director and one of the delegates, were you on any committees in addition to that?
I was not.
Okay.
Just leading my state delegation was really in my shoes, and given my timeline of how long I've been in that role, a pretty big lift. Just seeing how it worked. This was my first conference to be a part of. I was slated to be there in 2020, but just going through that process was a huge lift. Becoming familiar with the full NCST manual. Of course, Tennessee adopts it pretty well as it is, with some additions to it. But learning, just that process of how we move things forward was very eye-opening. It was enlightening. It was refreshing to come out of NCST re-energized and to see this national arms linking moment where we all come together. Yes, we have differences of opinions on certain topics, and that's fine. That's what it's supposed to be about. But we're all there for one goal.
Now I am joined by Max Christensen, the Senior Safety Advocate at First Light Safety Products and a former State Transportation Director. Max, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here, Amanda. Thank you for asking me.
Okay, so you have been involved in several NCSTs over the years. How long were you? So you were a state director in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
How long were you doing that, and how many NCSTs then does that put you through? Tell us kind of your history with this.
Alrighty. I was a state director in Iowa for 21 years. I started in 2003. So I've actually this was my fourth NCST. If it hadn't been for COVID in 2020, it would have been my fifth. But of course, we all know what happened there. So I've been to the 2005, 2010, 2015, and now the 2025 NCSTs.
And now, was this last one your first one not as the state director? You're in the back of the room with the rest of us interested.
I was, yes. It was a much different perspective, that's for sure.
It was. So we're going to get more into that in a minute. First, tell me, what role did you play, if any, in this Congress? Because I think, did I hear that you're responsible for securing the location 10 years ago?
Yes. In 2015, well, we had been at the University of Missouri in Warrensburg for quite a number of years. And in the fall of 2014, we lost our contract there. So we had about a 6-month window to secure a new place, get everything set up, et cetera, et cetera. So 2015, of course, then was the first year to be in Des Moines. And we would have been there again in 2020. But of course, COVID kind of knocked that out of contention. So anyway, we chose then to be back here in Des Moines in 2025. And I actually was still on the steering committee up until about a year ago.
Now, there is another man who was on stage with you at some points there. Charlie Hood was maybe the main cat wrangler.
Yeah, he's the Congress chair. Is what he was.
Yeah.
Okay.
What did it mean to have him kind of come back to this after?
Well, that was huge because he is one of the few people that have been through this process from the steering committee / leadership part of the Congress. So it was critical that we had his assistance on that. And again, you could see the value of that very, very easily. He kept things rolling, didn't get overburdensome, and it was definitely not boring. So I think it made the whole process more palatable for everybody.
Yeah.
More enjoyable.
Yeah. Well, and
as enjoyable as you could be in a situation where you have a lot of parliamentary debate.
Right. So Robert's rules ruled the room.
Yeah.
I could also sense the amount of respect everybody had for Charlie and the experience he brings. What was the mood like? I was in the back interested party area. What was it like closer up front?
There were times when it was intense because amendments would be offered and you're trying to talk to your delegation. We're spread out left to right, trying to get everybody's opinion. What do we think on this? So there are times when it got a little frantic, but that's exciting. That means we're having conversation, meaningful conversation on how we continue to make sure that school buses are safe and that they're safe for our students and they continue to be the safest mode of transportation. But on the flip side, the camaraderie around each other it's irreplaceable. There's rarely a time when we have 48 of the 50 states together in one room, all
Right.
all on the same level of passion, and that being the school bus. We just don't see that. So the laughter and the memories that we create just from being together is just as memorable as anything that we pass legislatively. We sit right in front of Texas, and so the two TAPTs were kind of barking at each other in good fun. But when we have very intense conversations, that mood is relaxed. But again, we are there to focus on a goal. But being on the floor, it's just a different atmosphere.
How did you handle votes for your state? Did you get your whole table to kind of come to a consensus and agree, or were there ever split votes? And then what do you do in that case?
So we had we did meet as a delegation. We once everything was finalized as far as what was going to be presented at Congress, I distributed that out to our 9-person delegation, and then we met once in person with our OEMs, manufacturer representatives, and went through each individual item, and we talked about it. And yes, internally there were split votes, and before we began, we just came to the consensus that this was going to be a majority rule. The delegation was built to have 9 representatives, which prevented a tie vote from occurring. And then we sent that out, our stances from that 9-person delegation to our entire stakeholder group, which is all of our district and charter transportation directors, because our 9 decisions, our 9 votes are representing 240 some odd transportation operations across the state. And so we needed their feedback. And we had internal mechanisms where if the stakeholders disagreed, then they could essentially veto us, and we would revisit that. We did not have that occur. But even on the floor with amendments, there were times when we did have disagreements. But, again, we knew that we were all there and we were going to take whatever the delegation majority was.
What about you, Tina?
Well, I was not on the delegation for
Oh, you
South
weren't?
Carolina,
Okay.
no, but I was setting up front because I was on the technical assistance committee.
Mm.
So while we were sitting up there, we were waiting to see if any proposals come across that needed a little further investigation to see, if it was a heavy burden on the states, or if it went against any legislation, or if it was technically safe to do. So that's kind of our three items that we would look at. We did actually get several items come to us that we actually got to discuss and bring back to the chair. But sitting up there and watching the delegates and how they work together, and how they communicated, it was all very professionally done, I think. And I think people really took their time to think about what was safest for the child.
Now, Alex, you did go up to the mic a couple of times. What were the issues that you felt most compelled to, I guess, speak your piece about?
I think a lot of it just, from someone who grew up in government, from childhood on with my parents and knowing the legislative process, part of it was just to remind folks. We would go back, to the microphone just to remind everybody that while we do refer to the NCST manual as kind of the transportation Bible, it is not a regulated agency. And so if we vote on something as this body, and you don't want to put it into effect, you're not mandated to. Now, would you have to justify it potentially as to why you elected not to enact something that voted upon? Sure, that's part of it. But so many people would get hung up on should versus shall, must versus may, and so trying to sometimes move that conversation along. And sometimes it was making sure that if we were adopting language, that it was not tailored necessarily to one state's or one vantage point, that it was going to be an all-inclusive amendment or addition to anything that we were voting upon.
Well, there were a few things that were brought up that had I been a state director, I definitely would have gotten up and voiced my opinion on.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, as a vendor on the back side of the room, you just have to sit there and listen, which was a few things that were a little bit difficult to just sit there and listen to, but that's how the cookie crumbles, I guess.
What were
Mhm.
some of those things that made you squirm a little bit?
I think the biggest thing was when the suggestion was made that the industry should allow 15 passenger vans. That
Yes.
has been a huge no-no for as long as I can remember, and even before then. And as we all know, they are not allowed federally. So the
Yeah.
fact that it was even brought up kind of surprised me. And
Right.
I was very happy to see that it was defeated by I believe it was a 44-1 vote. And the only way they can allow a 15 passenger van is if they bought it used, which is
Right.
a workaround from the federal rules.
Hmm.
And in my mind, if a vehicle's not safe when it's new, or if the federal government does not consider a vehicle to be safe when it's brand new, why would it be safer when it's used? And I just feel that
Right.
that's something the industry needs to stay away from.
Were there any other pieces that surprised you?
I was really surprised that electric mirrors were not mandated, because I've heard about 79% of all new bus sales come out with electric remote, the remote
Okay.
control mirrors. I thought that was just going to be an easy one, and it failed, which that one really did surprise me.
There
And
was
another one that kind of surprised me was the second stop arm.
That's exactly what I was gonna
Because
ask you about.
a lot of states already mandate the second stop arm. So I thought,
Yeah.
well, that could come through, but it didn't. So that was
Right.
a little bit of a surprise.
So that
Yeah,
was in the school bus specification section. And I read
correct.
uh,
Yes,
a bus measuring 30 feet or larger should have the front and rear stop arms.
correct.
And after some
Yes,
back and forth, the language went back to may instead of shall,
May.
leaving it optional. Obviously, you work for a stop arm manufacturer. Did that disappoint you then?
It that's a hard one to answer. I mean, I personally feel that a second stop arm is effective.
Yeah.
We've allowed it in Iowa, or we've mandated it in Iowa for I think
Okay.
about the last 10 years, something like that. So I'm a believer in it, whether I'm a vendor of it or not. I was still a believer in it
Yeah.
way prior to being a vendor. So yeah, there was some disappointment there, but not
Yeah.
necessarily as a vendor, just simply from a safety viewpoint. Mhm.
There were a couple of state delegates, excuse me, who stood up and said that they have them in their state, but they don't see it changing
Mhm.
violations in any way. It's kind of useless, they said.
Yep.
Is there any data around that? I mean, I know we studied stop arm passings in general, but have we compared the 1 versus 2 signs?
Not that I'm aware of, and I would like to see that compared, because that they were speaking, I think, generally speaking. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that assessment, but
Mhm.
without the data to back it up, I'm not sure who is right. Going back to the remote control uh, outside mirrors, I
Mhm.
can't understand why anybody would be against that, because um, I used to be a local transportation director,
Mhm.
and you bring in your substitute bus drivers. The mirrors don't always fit everyone. I mean, there
Yeah.
has to be some adjustment there. And not very often will you see a substitute bus driver get out of their bus and actually manually move those mirrors to fit where they're sitting.
Mhm.
So that to me was a big surprise. But again, we've had those in Iowa for years and years and
Yeah.
years. So yeah, there were enhancements made to identification and the school bus stop arms. And that's something that, quite frankly, hasn't been touched for decades. That language, I don't believe, has been touched for decades. So, certainly as a vendor, and even more so for the safety of the children riding our buses, I think that that's a huge move forward, is to make our buses more identifiable with better identification, and of course, better stop arms and
Yeah.
better equipment that way. Mhm.
Yeah. So, what were some of the key issues or debates that were discussed and voted on at the Congress that stood out to you?
I think to me, seeing how quickly the student crossing arm on the front of the bus that just sailed through with
Yeah.
very little debate. Tennessee has had that in place since the around 2010, so it was a no-brainer for us, but to see that, knowing that the loading and unloading time are typically the most dangerous portions of the school bus route, and making sure that that mechanism is there to ensure students are seen, especially on our littles, because they're still learning to process, and our bigs just the same. The second stop sign was a little shocking to me. I didn't expect the kickback on that, but see that get voted down was just a little bit of a shock. But that's part of it. We can continue to add that if we so choose. And then I think the fact that we had discussion on the 15 passenger van, as many notices and white papers and opinions have been put out on the 15 passenger van, to even have that on the floor, I think that was kind of the biggest wow moment. I was happy to see that one voted down, but that one really kind of took me by surprise.
Tina, what's your take?
I was shocked that it even come to the floor when there is so much research. South Carolina even has a law that's Jacob's Law regarding that. I was very pleased to see that voted down because it is dangerous.
The special needs and the infants and toddlers sections had a lot of changes, mostly to just modernize the language. And then there was also a section added for confidentiality and Head Start guidance. Walk me through what were the key takeaways our viewers need to know about those pieces.
I think for the most part in these, especially in the infants and toddlers and preschoolers, it had been quite a while since it had been updated to our today's standards. So there was quite a bit that needed updating. A lot of times when we read guidelines, it's not very clear what we're trying to get across because it's technical writing or something like that. And we actually made it to where, a district could read it and understand exactly what they needed to do. And I think bringing it up to those terms made a difference. I was really pleased to hear that the 2 handrails on all buses came into play, because that, with our students that has disabilities, we always try to transport them with their peers. That is the least restrictive environment, and having the dual handrails will go a long way, and them having the ability to board a general ed bus. So that was a good one.
Okay, so let's take yourself outside of being NCST chair, and now you're just the state director for Indiana. But sitting through the Congress, what stood out to you?
Well, I think the most important outcome that I saw from my perspective is that the delegations seem to be prepared. I mean, naturally, as you could tell, we got done early than we were scheduled. I was not really surprised in the things that I thought would be controversial. The alternative transportation. We knew that there was going to be some discussion about that. I was a little surprised that we spent as much time as we did with the activity bus portion of that. That was a little interesting to me. Unlike certain previous Congresses, I didn't see anything that caused me any kind of concern. Didn't seem like anybody wasted anybody's time. The tough part is to separate, as you just talked about with me and the steering committee, is to separate yourself from your state versus what is a national standard. And that's hard to kind of keep that separation going, because we can't, New York City would be a perfect example. Most districts or most states can't afford to have left side school bus doors along with a right side school bus door. So you have to divorce yourself from what your local needs are versus what a national standard would be.
I'll say it was a little surprising for me, speaking of the other new and the emerging technologies, was I was sort of expecting there to be guidance on what some of those emerging technologies are and how we handle them. And instead it was more so, here's a process for evaluating them on your own time.
The thing that I would look at that, and I equate it back to school buses in general, there's something in the neighborhood of 6,000 options you can put on a school bus. So to say this is an emerging technology, yes and no, because the school transportation community is always years behind the regular transportation community. LED lights is a perfect example. How many years did it take before the school bus community really jumped in both feet to adopt that? So you got to be a little careful about saying, well, this is emerging technologies, but having some kind of process in place to evaluate whether that makes good sense for you or not makes really good sense. And the EV bus is a really good example of that. Can be a very good addition to your fleet, but it has its limitations currently. So it's some things that you need to be very careful of that you may not think about. Yeah, as I think about it, I'm, when I was sitting there thinking, well, what more could we have for emerging technologies? And the bottom line, or the far in the future, would be an autonomous driver type of vehicle. I sit there and think, what else can we add on to a bus? And we're already adding most of that stuff, so it's kind of tough to say where. And that's the tough part about it. You can't say what's coming up next. Not so many years ago, EVs were so far out in left field, no one was talking about it. So it's amazing how much that can change. So it's hard to predict where we'll be in the future. So
okay, so you mentioned the alternative transportation was one of the topics that got people kind of fired up.
Yep.
And even though it is a controversial topic for some, everyone conducted themselves very professionally. I was very happy to see that it was a fruitful conversation. But so there's so much back and forth, right, going about the driver standards and the driver training specifically. We came up with all these rules, and then we kind of slashed them and said, let's leave it up to state and local jurisdiction. Was that the right move in the end?
Personally, I don't think so. I think there should be still a national standard, at least some kind of minimums out there. And I would relate it to entry level driver training. And I had this conversation with some leadership at the FMCSA. I said, why don't you give us a national curriculum? This is supposed to be a national training standard. Why don't we have a national base curriculum that we can base the training off? I would say the same thing here. There are certain things that I think, even if you don't agree with them, they should be things that you should be thinking about. Should you drug test an alternative transportation driver? Why not? You do it for school bus drivers, because remember, this is not a case of, well, we can't do that in our state. This is not a state issue. This is a national issue. And those transporters, good, bad, or indifferent, are there to transport students just like we are. So we're trying to set up the safest process possible. And I was a little disappointed that we got a little parochial in what we wanted to come out of that. Not we, but certain people wanted to come out of that particular section.
I was actually curious, though, the debate on what drivers, whatever rules that the states have for their school bus drivers and their alternative drivers.
Yeah.
Some has the same rules and some has different rules. And so the fact that, it was voted that they should follow the same rules was a good thing to me. I think that was necessary, and I think it's needed, because we all know that the yellow school bus is the safest mode of transportation, period. But we also know that there's districts out there that uses alternative transportation. And unfortunately, there is not a lot of guidance on alternative transportation for school districts. And I think the fact that it was brought up and it was voted on here shows that it is something that we do need to spend more time thinking about, and making sure that if it is used, that it's used safely, because not every state has the same needs. And, that is absolutely true. But if the state decides that a school bus driver should have XYZ training and, a license check or, whatever, then the drivers of alternative transportation really should follow that same rule. So I was actually pleased that it was voted that whatever the state decides for bus drivers should also be for alternative drivers as well.
What else stands out to you, or do you think that people should know that they might not otherwise about the NCST in general?
I think one of the things that we really took away, that I specifically took away, was on the topic of mandating LED lights with the exception of the headlight and turn signal mechanism. And I thought when we discussed that at our delegation meeting, I thought, well, this is a no-brainer. Why would we not? They're brighter, they're more cost efficient. And then somebody stood up and said, if we say that they must be LED, we see how quickly technology is changing. Well, now we've just limited ourselves to only LED. If something new and better were to come along, and that's just not a process or a thought that I had in our initial discussions. So I think the takeaway from that was having so many professionals in so many different arenas of student transportation is such an advantageous meeting that it provides such proactive conversation that what we didn't think of, somebody else is going to think of. And it takes all of us being there together to realize that.
What else should people unfamiliar with NCST know? If you had to pick one key takeaway, what would that be?
It's a lot of work, actually. Having sat on the steering committee, for many, many years, almost 10 years, I guess. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes, getting ready for the Congress itself, making sure that all the writing committees are in place, getting people to even be on those writing committees, because it's all volunteer labor.
Yeah.
And of course, we all have, our day jobs that we have to take care of. And, to get that many volunteers lined up for such a long period of time, because NCST doesn't just happen overnight. Typically, it's been about a 3-year process from the time you really get started until it happens.
Yeah.
And after it happens, why then it's not like, wow, it's just all done.
If you had one piece of advice for members of the delegation the next time we have NCST, what would that be?
First thing is spend more time as well prepared as the delegations were. I also sense that there were a lot of people that were not familiar with the NSTSB. And I will tell you, in my state, that is certainly the case. When I mention the NSTSB, people go, what are you talking about? So that would be the first thing, is to become familiar with that particular document, because that's what everything is based off of.
Yeah.
And just spend more time looking over those proposals that are done and making sure that they're working for you and your state delegation. I will tell you, one of the changes we will make is we will get this out sooner to the delegation so that they have more time. The other thing I would tell them is start looking at your delegation now for 5 years. Where do you think you might be at? Start prepping those people. Give them plenty of time to get in there. Because again, when I talk to a lot of people, the National Congress on what are we doing there? That would probably be helpful as well on that part of it.
Okay. If someone's watching this and they're interested in getting involved, maybe they want to be one of those delegates, how would they go about that?
Well, for the delegations, this is a hands-off for us. That's determined by your state. So we sent out a letter 2.5 years ago to the various prominent person that we would contact. Might be the governor, might be the Secretary of Education, might be the director of the Department of Transportation, and said, here, you need to pick your delegation. So you'd have to work that through your state. And so you just need to find out who that person would be and just make contact with it. And I would take that same step one step further, because we're asking a lot of people, hey, would you like to be interested in being on a writing committee? There you can contact me or anybody on the steering committee or your state delegation chair and say, hey, look, I'd like to be on a writing committee. I would love to have more people involved. If you saw who the writing committees are, there are a lot of very talented people, but I didn't see as many younger individuals.
Okay.
We need a mix of that.
Good point. And if there's anyone watching who's interested in this and you're not sure who your state director is, we can link that down below the description.
Yes.
And NASDIPS has that listed on their website for easy access.
Correct. Yes. So all else fails, even if you don't know who your delegation chair is, you can make contact with your state director. And when you mention delegation, I would like to see particularly those districts, those states that have very small delegations.
Yes.
I would love to see more people get involved. Correct.
How fantastic would it be to have the entire country represented?
Well, at the same time, the two that weren't there, we also had some that were here this time for the first time.
Yes.
And that was stunning to us that we actually had them involved in it. So yes, if we can get to 51, because it'd be 50 states in the District of Columbia,
Yeah.
if we can get all of them there, that would be the ultimate goal on that, because
Yeah.
you can truly say this is a national standard.
The other thing we didn't mention before is even if you're not a state delegate or on a committee, you can be an interested party who just attends the NCST and you sit in the back and you don't have any involvement in the proceedings, but just observing was so interesting and hearing the conversations. And I mean, anyone can do that.
Yeah, we'd love to have anybody that would like to come. It's like anything. You know how many of us talk about our legislators or our regulators? Why did they do this? Why did they make this law? Why did they make this regulation? Well, now you got to actually see it, and it can make a little bit more sense as to why these are being done. Well, I'd love to see hundreds upon hundreds of people just out there watching, just being part of the process.
I hope this gave you some more insight into what went down in Des Moines, as much of it may affect many of you watching this. One other thing I want to do is give a big shout out to some of the folks who made sure that everything went smoothly. Rhonda Weber, the executive director at NASTIPS, played a critical role in organizing the event and disseminating the information for the whole thing to come together. The Iowa Pupil Transportation Association hosted everyone. Some other key roles were Laura Mead as parliamentarian and Laura Whaley as on-site editor, not to mention everyone who served on the committee and part of the delegation. This is one time where it's crystal clear how much this industry cares and works together for the safety of our nation's children. You can find the full recap of NCST at the link below on our website. Let us know your reactions and your hot takes. That's it for today, but you can find more school bus headlines and hot topics on our website anytime. Be sure to follow our YouTube channel and connect with us on social media. And a big thank you to the sponsor of the route, IC Bus, proudly offering vehicles and solutions that are ahead of its class. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for riding with us.